want to start with a story, and we'll just get this out the way. I was born in South Africa, so if you're wondering where my accent's from, that's where it's from. And our story takes us to where I was born. At the beginning of the year, I visit my family about once a year, and my husband and I were there this January visiting with some friends, and we took some time out for a little mini vacation. And as you're apt to do with friends on the car ride back, we have this deep discussion about the world's massive global issues. In a car ride of 3 hours, we're going to solve the world's problems. But the question comes up in this car ride of what can we or should we do as one person? And interestingly enough, I'm going to borrow a line from one of our friends that weekend. She said something which was apt in that moment, which I want to share with you. If you've ever thought yourself too small to make a difference, you've never been alone in a room at night with a mosquito. And if you want to write that down, there it is. You can use it. I think it's a great line. And trust me, I'm a mosquito magnet, so I know their impact, these tiny little beings. So what I want to talk about today is love in action, and what that conversation inspired for me to think about, which is often when that question comes up is what should we do or what can we do as one person, is I often feel that there's kind of a feeling of maybe hopelessness or a not sureness. What's the direction to take or what's the step to take? And so I thought about the way to answer that is love in action and being an agent of change. And how we do that is through being of service to the greater good of all. And so what I want to talk about is what I think of as 3 steps. And the first step is service to self. And I'll just mention some of the topics here, and we'll go through each one separately. So service to self, I think of as reaching for joy. And the way we can do that is harnessing the power of your mind, right? Resilience. And we'll spend a fair amount of time on this because I think this is something that many people struggle with, in particular the last 4 years, if we think about resilience. And we'll look at it through the framework of the subtle bodies. Service to others, right? And what service to others looks like is being a beacon of light, what that means. And what it means is through your value field. So I'll share with you what I think of that. And lastly, or not exclusively, service to source by being guided by universal values and principles, or at least what I come to think of as universal values and principles, and how that guides us to being an agent of flow and change. And lastly, answering a call. So that will be kind of where we end off. So what we find ourselves within is 3 gates, right? 3 gates that guide us in living from or putting love into action. The first one is kindness. And so I think here it shows up. Does it promote unity? Does it promote union and harmony? Is it useful or is it helpful? Does it facilitate positive change? And lastly, is it true? No truth is absolute. So in other words, does it cut through illusion? And if we look at this is a series of overlapping circles. And what I invite you to think about is that love in action, service to self, service to others, and service to source is going to always be relative to where someone is at their stage of evolution, their stage of growth. And again, this guiding principle, we could think about these 3 gates. Is it kind? Is it useful or helpful? And is it true? So, kind of keep this in the back of your mind if you can as we go through the rest of the presentation. So before we get into those steps, I want to give a little bit of background, which I think is kind of useful to think about. In particular, the topic, which is a really big topic, illuminating a path to a better world, elevating consciousness. So what is consciousness? Well, I can only relate to it from my own experience. I remember being 3 years old And I was sitting in the sandbox, or we call it a sandpit in school. And I looked around and I saw all these other kids there, and I was aware suddenly of the thoughts in my mind. And one of the questions that came to me was, who am I? Okay, now, not every 3-year-old asks themselves these existential questions. Who am I? I happen to, have that happen to me. And it's a question that sort of stayed with me. I can't say that I've come to a conclusive answer. I think I'm still figuring out who I am, as I'm sure many of you are figuring that out for yourselves. But I think that using the analogy of the lotus, and by the way, that's not a lotus flower. I couldn't find one, but I've taken a picture of a water lily, but we get the idea. So like the lotus that rises out of the mud, I believe that we ourselves can realize and reach our awakened an awakened experience of ourselves. So the inherent Buddha nature, awakened one, awakened in ourselves. And to realize that what we are is beyond the physical form, the clothing, that there's a soul or a spark within us, and that there's consciousness in all things. And what we're striving towards, at least what I think of, is unity consciousness. So I think an important framework, at least in my mind, for myself, and I invite you to think about it too, is ethics. Everyone is on a journey of learning and growth, or at least what I think of as learning and growth, self-remembering. And I want to share with you this quote from Annie Besant. Again, I love Annie Besant too. What is good for one man may not be good for another man. What is good at one time or place may not be good at another time or place. Ethical science is therefore a relative science. It's relative to the man himself and his surroundings. So I think if we think of this in the context of evolution and growth, that we can think of ethics then as it's relative to each person's growth at one time or another, and that what is true for one person is relative to their stage and evolution of growth. And so ethics applies in that sense of evolution. So I've written or quoted the book that it's from. I recommend you can read it, Sanatana Dharma, an advanced textbook of Hindu religion and ethics. So I think it would be good to take this as a little thought experiment. I'm sort of borrowing this loosely from that book, from Annie Besant. So I want to invite you to just close your eyes for a moment, and we can digest some of this as well. And that is, if we think about harmony and establishing harmony or establishing unity consciousness, if you start with yourself, what does that feel like for you? And then if you expand that circle, that ripple from yourself outward, what does harmony feel like in establishing it between you and your family members? And imagine other families themselves doing the same thing. And then let's take the circle a little further, a little wider. What does harmony and establishing harmony feel like in a community? And then to go a little further, between a nation or in a nation and between nations. And then harmony across humanity. And if we can stretch our consciousness a little bit more and include now the inhabitants of the planet, the earth. And if we can imagine that we're not the only beings in the universe, that perhaps there are other beings, other worlds perhaps, what does harmony look like in this further and further circle? So you're welcome to open your eyes. Thank you for joining me in that thought experiment. Just noticing and wanting to name the feeling of the energy that shifted in the room as we all sort of took ourselves a little bit further and further. And if we think about, unity consciousness and harmony and that ripple, especially if we think about it as being the mosquito and the capacity we have to affect change, the ripple is quite large, right? Now, I know this is familiar to many, if not most of you, and I love this mantra or prayer or invocation from Annie Besant, but I think it's a useful thing to think about in terms of orienting our consciousness, orienting our thoughts in the direction of harmony, of unity consciousness. If you have a meditation practice or if you don't have a meditation practice, I think this can be a wonderful way of thinking about orienting ourselves, meditating on the words. So I'll say this, and you're welcome to join me. So we'll start with, O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. May all who feel themselves as one with thee know they are therefore one with every other. So let's just let that sit for a moment and just feel into the words that she offers. So I want to use that mantra as a way of thinking about cutting through illusion. So illuminating the path. So without light, we know that it's dark, and without darkness, there can't be light. And for my Star Wars fans out there, in a dark place we find ourselves, and a little more knowledge lights our way. Yoda, anyone? So joy is our natural state of being. And I took the 3 L's out of Annie's invocation as just a starting point to think about what could be cutting through illusion as a way to shed light, to illuminate. So if we start with life, what is the hidden life as we peel back the veil? Well, for me, one of those things is knowledge of the true self. And we started with the question, well, what's consciousness? And I asked the question as when I was 3, and I'm still asking, who am I? So turning inward and that process of discovery. And I often say that I think it actually takes courage to look at yourself, because the ego personality that wants to be in charge often has a way of wanting to be in charge, in control, and hide the beauty that's within. So we need that courage to look beyond the things that we think are sometimes difficult, the parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily like. But what shines within is the true self. And I also think with life is the underlying nature of all things. We can certainly see that as an echo in one of the 3 objects of the Theosophical Society. So light, well, for me, that's the soul. And from the soul, we bring in wisdom, we bring in insight, discernment, and higher understanding. So, discernment is really, really important because as we work with discovering ourselves, we're always measuring everything against our own inner discernment, our own inner knowing. So whatever I say today is measured against your own inner discernment, right? Peeling back that layer and then illuminating our limiting beliefs and blind spots. So, I can only see so much from this angle, right? But if I turned around, I still can't see what's behind me. So we have to find a way of working on shedding light on those veils that hide the true self. And sometimes that is outside of us. We have a teacher outside of us who helps us see that. The work is inward, turning inward to see those things, and having that courage to look at those limiting beliefs. And lastly, love. Last but not least, love. And I think of this as the interconnection and interdependence versus separation. So I think the greatest illusion is this idea that we're a separate self. Again, I think that's a message that we've heard and said in different ways this weekend. And so what connects us is this flow of love and interdependence with all. So with this foundation, we can talk about service to self. And the first step is reaching for joy. So I have this note here from Annie Besant: as the mind obeys the soul, so must the lower nature obey the mind. So harnessing the power of your mind, I think of first as clear intentions, developing a single-pointed mind. So it's my understanding that we create our reality through our thoughts and through our beliefs. And the clearer we are with what we intend, the clearer it is the reality that we create for ourselves. And the more single-pointed or the more focused we are with that, the clearer it is. So clear intentions, clear thinking. It's natural to have moments of obsessive thinking or to have random thoughts. So if you travel, you might be obsessively worried. Is the flight going to be on time? Am I going to be on time? Is there going to be traffic? And, the kind of the constant worry. But it clouds the mind and it clouds our capacity to think clearly. So eliminating obsessive thoughts, and those random thoughts that come in. So, if you're listening right now, all of a sudden your consciousness might shift and a thought pops into your head, I forgot to feed the cat, or, I forgot to, put the trash out. So just those little thoughts that come in, those are more benign examples, but the more, say, incapacitating thoughts that come in and cloud the judgment. And then clear observation, controlling your reactions. When we're clearer in our capacity to hold a neutral or an emotionally neutral state of observation, we're less likely to be reactionary. And from that place, we can see with clearer eyes or a higher perspective. So clear observation. So clear intentions, clear thinking, clear observation. 3 things to think about, not a exclusive list, but just a place to start in harnessing the power of the mind. So resilience, what do we think of as resilience? I want to start with a few dictionary definitions. The capacity to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties, toughness, so the remarkable resilience of so many institutions, the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape, elasticity. I like that, elasticity. Nylon is an excellent in wearability and resilience. And then this last one, the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness. So toughness, elasticity, withstand. So here's my own definition of personal resilience. Our capacity to withstand external forces and pressures that would take us off our center. Our ability to adapt to changing forces and conditions and remain in that center. And our capacity to exercise the flexibility of our consciousness, to marshal our internal and outer resources to maintain or restore balance, right? So if we think back to that question, well, what can we do or what should we do as one person in the face of all these global issues? And I know that's a question that's come up in terms of looking at some of the the duality or the seeming duality of things is when we're less resilient, we have less life force available to us, and we're less able to respond to those external pressures. So I believe resilience is actually really important. And we can think about it as a personal practice, as a spiritual practice. And the opposite of resilience I think of as empathy crisis. Again, my own definition, a perceived feeling of hopelessness and helplessness, leading to an inability to regulate effective decision-making. So I'll read that again. A perceived feeling of hopelessness and helplessness, leading to an inability to regulate effective decision-making. So empathy is the ability to feel into what someone else is experiencing, to almost take that step into their shoes, to sort of know from within yourself what that feels like. But we're destabilized when we go way beyond that, in particular when we're thinking about taking on or trying to think about how to solve the world's problems. And again, not to say that we shouldn't think about these things, but not to go so far as to be so destabilized as to be unable to take a step in any direction. So what's the antidote? Immunity. Very simply making external forces harmless, right? That's the antidote. And the way to make that antidote work, so to speak, is what I think of as through the subtle bodies. That's the framework we'll work with. And a lot of what I'll mention is common sense, but just because it's common sense doesn't mean it's commonly practiced, right? So we'll work with the 4 subtle bodies. And I've thought of 4 questions that can go with each one. So if we start with the physical or etheric, what do you experience? At the astral or emotional, what do you feel? At the mental or mind, what do you believe? And at the causal level, what do you know? So let's take the physical first. So I think of the physical body as being grounded, right? Or the physical etheric level of consciousness being grounded and embodied. We're both spirit and matter. And sometimes I'm sure you've heard the term, well, that person or I feel ungrounded. What does that mean? It's really to have this balance between your non-material self, spirit, and your material self, fully grounded in the physical plane. And we're much more resourced with our life force when we're grounded, or consciousness is grounded and embodied through the body. Also, well-being. We all know what it feels like when we're like a little under the weather. If you've got a cold, or if you've got the flu, there's not a lot of life force that's necessarily available to do other things, to think about other things. But when we feel the sense of well-being and vitality, we're much more able to be present for everything. So simple things, simple practices, again, common sense, maybe not commonly practiced because we forget. Exercise is the first one. Right? This could be simple movement practices, going for a walk outside, yoga. That's always going to be a default for me because I practice and teach yoga, but any movement practice that gets you back into the body and gets the blood flow flowing. Time in nature, right? We are a microcosm of the larger macrocosm, and time in nature reminds us of that essential connection and that interconnectedness, but it's also very supportive. Food, because when our bodies are fed, we have the capacity to digest all the information that we're taking in. So nourishing food becomes the symbol that we convert of what we're taking in and nourishing our minds with. So thinking about nourishing foods. And lastly, rest. And I don't mean sleep, right? Sleep is not the only way we rest. And for some people, sleep can be elusive. But there are lots of ways to rest. This could be things like doing nothing, right? Doing nothing can be restful, right? Reading a book, watching the trees blow with the wind, watching a sunset. That can be very restful. Things that allow the mind to disengage from the constant processing of all the sensory information that we're taking in. So rest is very important. So this sets our base foundation. Next, if we look at the astral or emotional level, I think of this as being centered. As I mentioned sort of before, from the mind's perspective, being able to control our reactions. When we're centered, we're able to withstand the waves of emotions that come up. So emotions are often likened to like an ocean, or a raging river, or what other things can we relate to? A rainstorm, right? So when we're centered, we're able to withstand those storms. And not to say that we shouldn't have emotions. I think that's often a misconception, but rather to be able to be present without being taken way off center and lose our connection to ourselves. So being centered, and that's also establishing calmness and equipoise. It's also about flow, so flowing with experience, flowing with emotions, and constructive expression, finding appropriate channels to express what we're thinking, feeling, and experiencing. So I have two here, and they're actually interrelated, breathing and meditation. So if breath and mind are essential, or rather, I think of breathing as the basis for meditation is essential. And years ago, I was listening to John Kabat-Zinn, who's very well known for developing mindfulness-based stress reduction. So I'm going to paraphrase him, and I'll apologize to John for if I get it wrong, if I misparaphrase him. But the example he used of how essential breathing and the practice of watching your breath is for developing a meditation practice is if you think about your breath, our breath is involuntary. We breathe without thinking, right? But if I asked you to sit and concentrate on your breath for 5 breaths without losing your focus, could you do it? And so imagine if we had to do that all the time. Well, we'd probably stop breathing, because I don't know about you, but I know when I'm driving, it's hard to keep my focus all the time. So with breathing, So breath meditation, very, very important as a foundation, I think, for developing this capacity to witness, to observe, to find our center. And by the way, there are lots of different meditation practices, meditation styles, many schools. I think of meditation very simply as whatever you put your focus on, where you can apply your concentration without interruption, very simply. So that could be any technique or any focal point. And I think the last one is dreams. I've had a dream practice where I've at least tried to remember my dreams whenever I can when I wake up in the morning. And dreams offer us insight and guidance as well. So there is a sense of inner support. So a few days ago before coming here, I woke up from a dream. Some of the imagery in my dream was I was in a kitchen. There was a refrigerator. There were magazines lining the fridge. I think they represented the slides of my presentation. And there was a guide in my dream. And the guide said to me, "Don't try so hard." I think he was reading my nerves. But it did help me let go a little bit and relax and not worry so much. So a dream practice. And Kurt actually offered a recommendation to me many years ago, which helped me develop my dream practice. It's a book that I don't believe is in print anymore, The Dream Game by Anne Faraday. If you can find that, it was for me a useful starting point for developing a dream practice. And what I mean by that is a kind of a dictionary, your own library of words and images to help you interpret the information that's coming to you from your inner wisdom, your soul, however you want to think about that. So let's move on to the mental level, to the mind, the mental body. And so 3 things to think about here are being clear and wisdom and illumination. So you might have heard of an analogy for the mind that's sometimes used is if you envision the mind as a lake, a clear lake, the surface of the mind when it's undisturbed is like that calm, clear lake. And if you are lucky enough to live next to a clear lake and the water is clear 15 feet deep, it's like glass, right? So it not only is something you can see through completely, it reflects what is outside of it. In this case, it would be the sky. And when that lake water is disturbed, all the sediment from the bottom churns up. And the mind, in this case, the analogy for the lake would be the waters would be muddied. So when we can settle the mind, when we can experience the mind in its pristine, unblemished nature, that's that clarity, we have the capacity to draw in the wisdom and the illumination. And it's not so much from the mind itself, but it's from a higher aspect of ourselves, the causal level of being, the soul's wisdom. But it's harder for that soul wisdom to penetrate when the mind is busy and disturbed, when that water is churned up. There's nothing for the mind to reflect back, no surface for it to shine that light and that wisdom. So, the practices here are, for example, uplifting content. And here's a perfect example. We've spent a weekend here at the Theosophical Society. We've listened to some incredible lectures, all of it uplifting content, raising our consciousness, and a lot more uplifting, let's say, than waking up and reading the news. First thing, right? Not necessarily as uplifting, although I don't know, it depends what news channel you watch in the morning. Spiritual practice, and this means different things to different people, but when you're grounded, or at least how I think about this is when I'm grounded in my spiritual practice, I'm much more clear and much more resourced at this level because my spiritual practice and my spiritual values inform my capacity to look out into the world from a more centered place. And I wanted to include this here. Help is always available, because when we think that we are on our own and that there's no help, or that we're isolated or separate, there's a lot less support and a lot less resources available to us. And so the way to turn that around is to remember that help is always available. And I put it here because it's a belief. And the mental body, or the level of the mind, is all about our beliefs, and we create our reality through our thoughts, through our beliefs. So remembering that help is always available. And finally, our last body, and there are more, but we're only going to work with these 4, is the causal level. Staying true to yourself. I've been reminded today to just be myself. So stay true to yourself. Well, it's not actually always that easy because, we have the baggage of, whether it's our past lives or this lifetime, the stuff that we pick up from our social and family conditioning, all the things that we need to sometimes unload in order to turn back inward to realize what's within. And that is that staying true to yourself. And I think of that as following your dharma. And the way I think of dharma is your path in life. And again, that's obviously different for everybody. And when you are turning inward, we can be guided by the soul and an inner teacher. Everyone has an inner teacher within them. And I love this from the Bhagavad Gita. I have to move over because I can't see from that end, and I don't know this off by heart. It is better to strive in one's own dharma than to succeed in the dharma of another. Nothing is ever lost in following one's own dharma, but competition in another's dharma breeds fear and insecurity. Just sit with that for a moment. So it's not uncommon to be pulled off your center, to be pulled off your path because society or social media is telling you what you should be doing or who you should be, right? Family pressures, friend pressures. And then, of course, there's your own judgments, right? So being able to stay true to yourself is effort and courage and work. And when we are, I think that's the strongest basis for resilience at this level. And it supports us all the way through to our embodied consciousness on the physical plane. So I was, just before we came to the TS this weekend, I got to visit the Art Institute. And Georgia O'Keeffe, there was this beautiful exhibition there. If you haven't been, I encourage you to go. And this is a quote that was there. I've always been willing to bet on myself, and been willing to stand on what I am and can do even when the world isn't much with me. Isn't that just such a great expression of staying true to yourself? You can really feel behind those words her knowing herself really deeply and not worrying really about what other people think, not being pulled off her center. So I wanted to include that because what a great example. And a reminder too that we can look to other examples around us as a model that we can draw on as inspiration for ourselves. Okay, service to others. Being a beacon. So that's a lighthouse. Now, we have an online audience. Normally I would ask the question and have take some answers from the audience, but just take a moment for yourselves to kind of think about what comes to mind when you see the picture of a lighthouse. I'll offer you some of my thoughts. There's land, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind. If this were a cloudy day and the lights were on, I would know the direction roughly that I was going in. So there's light, there's land. If there's obstacles, there's light to guide me. So this is what I think of as a lighthouse. It functions as letting sailors know what obstacles lie ahead, that there's land ashore, safe harbor, and you can follow this light. And if we think of ourselves each as a lighthouse, as a beacon, right? And by the way, very often there's usually only one person running the lighthouse. I think the term is a lighthouse keep. So back to what I said at the beginning, what can we or should we do as one person? Well, each person can be a lighthouse. Each person can be a source of inspiration or showing or providing a path that others can follow. So again, if you think that you can't, you can. We are, each of us, a lighthouse for others. And I think the way we can do that is through our value field. And what do I mean by that? So our beliefs shape our experience and manifest from energy into form. Our values are the actions that we take to put those beliefs into motion. And so a value field is a container that we carry, and it holds the tone of vibration for us around those particular values. And so here's an ideal, if you will. We're in a place that has a value field in itself, and we could say this is aspirational, to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. There's a feeling of aspiration here towards unity consciousness and a series of values or a set of values that we can adopt ourselves. And so when we're part of a community like this, we can feel the value field itself, right? So this is a way to think about that at an institutional level. But then this is perhaps homework for you when you go home today or tomorrow or in a few days, is to think about what are your personal values. And how does that create a a field around you of what you're drawing to you and what you yourself are drawn to, right? Or is, repelling. So if we take that a step further as service to source, and we move from personal values to universal values, this is what I think of as universal values. So kindness to self and others. Again, an echo here. I often like to say kindness is actually really not that hard to practice, because it can be as simple as you're walking down the street and someone's coming in your direction, you're going in their direction, you can smile. That's being kind, actually. It's recognizing that there's another person coming towards you and showing that recognition through a smile. Walking, helping a neighbor. We had a storm, I think it was in April this year. We live in New Hampshire, and there was a big outage. Lots of trees came down, and we walked over to our neighbor. There's only 3 of us. We live on an island. There were only 3 of us around year round, and so there was no one there. Just to check in, see, are you okay? Do you need water? The power was out, right? So simple things that we can do to be kind. And kind to oneself, think about how you talk to yourself inwardly, right? So self-deprecation, or telling yourself that you're not good enough, or things of that nature, is not kindness to oneself. And I'm a recovering perfectionist, so I can say that from experience. So, tolerance, another universal value. I think of this as building a bridge, right? Tolerance is often used in multiple ways, threshold and so on. Language is the way that the soul and the personality communicate with each other. So I'm using it in the sense of building a bridge of understanding and acceptance and welcoming to see the soul within. We will all have different backgrounds. Everyone in the room has different backgrounds. We all come from different experiences. But the bridge of accepting those differences is to understand that and to welcome that and to see that what's beyond those differences is what binds us together, and that's that soul within. So nonviolence in thought, word, and deed, and that's also our 3 gates. Is it kind? Is it true? Is it useful? I could say we could probably do a whole talk on just that, but to think about nonviolence in thought, word, and deed as a universal value. And then finally, forgiveness. Again, I think we're all on a path of learning and growth on our journey back to the source. And if we approach everything that we do as a lesson to be learned, then what we don't know about ourselves and what we tell ourselves, I should have known better, is really the lack of permission to forgive your lesser knowing self. And we can do that for others, right? So forgiveness, I think, is this essential component as a universal value, the permission to learn. So I think of compassion as an embodied skill. And anybody know the song from the Bee Gees, How Deep Is Your Love? I'm not going to sing. I can't sing. But, I think it's hard to imagine that love can be unconditional, but it is. And it's not practiced very easily by most of us. Our love is often conditional. And when we think about compassion, at least universally, how big is our circle of compassion? And I want to share a story. I have to read this. It inspired me when I heard it some years ago at this point. It's the story of a monk. His name was Palden Gyatso from Tibet. And he was a monk who was imprisoned for 2.5 decades or so. tortured. And the current Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, was interviewed by a man named Victor Chan. And he was asked about this person. This monk is now dead. But this is what H.H. had to say about this experience, and it illustrates our capacity for compassion. He told me the Chinese forced him to denounce his religion. They tortured him many times in prison. I asked him whether he was ever afraid. Lopan La then told me, yes, there was one thing I was afraid of. I was afraid I may lose my compassion for the Chinese. Isn't that immense? Someone who's been tortured and imprisoned, and the thing he's most afraid of is to lose his compassion. So I think that demonstrates the capacity we have as humans to expand our consciousness, to expand our capacity, to expand our love, right? So our compassion is not limited. Well, I'm compassionate to you, but not you. You have these beliefs, so I don't have compassion for you, right? But to be able to expand and open our capacity for that. So, said another way, Annie Besant, by showing love to others, we awaken love in them. By showing hate, we awaken hate. Very simple. And you could even say that that's an antidote. So where we find the seeds of hate arising in the mind, love would be the antidote. Service to source, again, being an agent of change and flow. So we all get stuck, right? Things happen. So what we're looking to do is to get ourselves unstuck. And that's true for everyone else. And we can facilitate that movement of stuck energy. So the first thing I think of is being centered as the capacity to be that agent, to move stuck energy. And the way we do that is when we're aligned with our soul, when we're centered in ourselves. Sensitivity, which is to be aware and attuned to the forces of change. I'll use the analogy of driving in a car in traffic on a Monday morning. I used to do this regularly. I don't, thankfully, anymore. But there's a long line of cars. You're trying to turn left across the oncoming traffic, and no one is letting you through. And there's just this long wave of cars. And eventually, someone kind enough stops and says, go on, go on. And finally, a little bit of that backlog is released. And, there's the pressure valve is released. So that's, a simple analogy. But really, when we're sensitive and attune ourselves towards where there are these plugs, these stuck areas, is we can be sensitive to facilitating the movement of energy, moving that stuckness. And finally, collaboration is the willingness to be an agent for the benefit of the greater good of all. Right? So I want to mostly finish with answering a call. And this is seeing Dharma from the perspective now of the source. And again, if you don't mind, I'm going to read this. My Dharma is the stage of evolution which my nature has reached in unfolding the seed of divine life, which is myself, plus the law of life according to which the next stage is to be performed by me. It belongs to the separated self. I must know the stage of my growth, and I must know the law which will enable me to grow further. Then I know my Dharma. And by following that Dharma, I am going towards perfection. So, in other words, when we are on our path, we're not trying to live someone else's. Someone else is not trying to have us live theirs or wanting us to live something different, but we're true to the path. And that path meets the path of the source. then we have a divine will that is able to flow through us, and we can answer a call and be responsive to this unity consciousness, this path that we're on. But we can't do that when we're trying to live someone else's life for them, or if somebody else is trying to live our life for us. We can really only live our life ourselves. Again, Annie Besant. That book is Dharma, which I think is available in the bookstore. So we're kind of at the end, and we're back to our 3 circles. And I just want to remind us of where we began. The circles of service to self as a step or a pillar for love in action, service to others, and service to source. And that what supports us is a constant reminder, a constant question of the 3 gates. Is it kind? Is it true? Is it useful? So what I hope that you'll be able to leave with today is a way to embody this for yourselves, to think about, can you be the mosquito? Not really, but in a sense. I have a couple minutes, and I had another slide that I wasn't sure I'd be able to include. And it's a prayer, and I'd love to read this, and I invite you to close your eyes and listen. I think that this is a wonderful way to feel that energy of unity consciousness. It comes from now deceased teacher Eknath Eswaran, and I often turn to him for inspiration and wisdom, and it's a universal prayer. So I'll go ahead and read it if you want to close your eyes, or feel free to keep them open. I offer to the Supreme Being my deeds, my words, my thoughts. May everyone reach the supreme goal. May everyone strive for the good of all. May noble thoughts fill the minds of all. May joy fill the hearts of all. May selfish people become selfless. May selfless people become illumined. May illumined people go beyond death, and may they help others to go beyond death. So thank you for your attention, everyone, and thank you for your energy.